Cultures have an incredible impact on our society, and not just anthropologically. Cultures from a microbial context have an equally significant impact on the industries that allow us to live the lives that we want. Jayashree Srinivasan is a microbiologist specialising in biotechnology and microbial research. Join us as we speak about Jaya's journey to cultivating cultures, the intersectionality of culture and identity, and the complementary nature of being both scientist and pastry chef. I'm Michele Ong, and this is Steam Powered. Good afternoon, Jayashree. Thank you so much for joining me on Steam Powered. I'm really looking forward to having a chat with you about your journey.
Hi, Michele. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've never done anything like this, so I'm excited.
I'm so excited to be your first. It's so great. So hopefully this will be nice and chill for you. But we shall get into where you started with your journey as a microbiologist. So what motivated you to study biology and biotechnology?
Way back, I was raised by two scientists, mom and dad, both biologists and professors in institutes in India. So all my life, I think everyone's always just expected that's what I would do, right? Like it's, your parents are scientists. You grew up. In fact, we grew up on campus. All my friends were kids of scientists. You would go outside and people are only talking science. It was a very, very immersive experience in childhood. And, when we went on holidays, they'd be also attending conferences, visiting people who are also in their field. So that always was that expectation. People expected me to score really well in science and specifically biology. And I think for a young person, if you're told that there's something you're expected to do, that is the last thing you want to do. You will fight that with every fiber of your being. And so I just rejected the idea just purely because I don't want to do what everyone thinks I should be doing. There's probably a bit of both, that I truly did enjoy biology, and also that if you're hearing so much about it, there is a fascination, right? Like when I was growing up, instead of drawing squiggles, mom and dad were teaching me how to draw like alpha helices and beta sheets of protein structures. So it's really hard to avoid it. So I think like the subliminal messaging went through when I did. There was a love for biology. I just was very conflicted about it. When I finished high school, biology was my best subject. It was the one that I enjoyed the most, much to my dismay.
How disappointing.
I was disappointed with myself. I thought I was going to be this really rebellious spirit and do something wild, but no, that's just what I wanted to do. I enrolled for university in India, and it's technically an engineering degree, but it's specializing in biotech. So I did a few engineering subjects and a few science subjects, but it was mostly like biology. And what biotechnology means is essentially the application of biology in the real world to solve real world problems. So we studied how you can use biology to address problems in the health industry, in the agriculture industry, food industry, anything. So it's quite broad. I think people often joke that if you study biotechnology, you're a jack of all trades and master of none, because a lot of people really get into, I'm going to study microbiology or biochemistry and get really into one thing. But with biotech, you study a little bit of everything, which I personally think is really, really good for someone who's starting out in their career, because you don't want to, just learn one thing and all your life you think that's what you love because that's all you've ever done. In fact, my boss recently told me that they do say jack of all trades, master of none, but there's another line to it that says, but better than an expert of one.
Yes.
So I see it as a strength that you do learn quite a bit of many different things. So anyway, I enrolled in engineering degree because it was a 4-year course that came with a research component in the end, and it had heaps of different internships embedded into it. And I knew that's what I need. I need a diversity of experiences. I've never been the most happy in a classroom setting because I'm quite restless. I like doing things with my hands. I like learning by doing. So typically a science degree in India would be a 3-year degree, and I saw that as maybe limiting options because 4-year degrees do open up a few more doors. So I did that, and university was quite a lot. I did the internships that I talked about. I took opportunities to travel and did an internship in France. I won a fellowship to go to the US because all of a sudden I decided that I want to study bioethics and learn what that is. So I went to New York and worked in a hospital to learn about bioethics. And that was really good. Finished university. I did like what they call in Australia your honours year. That was like our project component. I did that in stem cell research in a lab that is looking into using stem cells for cardiomyopathy, which is a heart disease. So I was studying one of the well-known genetic mutations that cause cardiomyopathy and is seen, unfortunately, quite commonly in India. I did that, and I knew that I really very much enjoyed my time in the lab. But the same thing happened again, where everyone said, oh, surely she's going to do her PhD now. That's what the obvious next step is. And I hated it. I hated that that's what everyone was saying I should do. And all along, I've always had such a big love for cooking, baking, making desserts. It was such a big passion of mine. So I decided, well, you know what? Did university. I'm going to go be a pastry chef now. And that's what I did. So I went to the other side of the world. This was my big adventure. Went to Melbourne, enrolled in patisserie, and studied that for 1.5 years. Worked in a few restaurants, had a really, really great time. I was here with my best friends. It was just like soul satisfying 1.5 years. Also, the amount of chocolate and cake that you get to eat and get to take home is just extraordinary. So that was such a good 1.5 years. And in that time, I gained skills that I don't think I would have gained if I had stayed in science at all, because a kitchen is really hard work. You learn how to be really efficient, how to be very resilient, how to deal with all kinds of people. And, I moved around within the hospitality sector a lot. And I keep telling people that if you've negotiated with a really drunk person at 3 a.m. when all you want to do is finish your shift and you've had that conversation in a civilized way, then you can negotiate with anyone. So once I finished that, I was working in restaurants. I really enjoyed it, but I knew that this is not what I want to do forever, and that I do, as much as I was trying to avoid it, do very much love science, and I do want to go back. So I decided to enroll in a master's by research. A master's by research is a bit different to a master by coursework in the sense that there's no classes. And like I said, I do not like classroom settings. It doesn't work for me. So you are in a project and you do that project for about 2 years. And then you write up a thesis and you present your work and you're awarded your master's if you do that successfully.
So it's quite self-guided, or is there...
Yeah.
Oh.
Very, very driven by the student. So I had 2 supervisors, one because I was placed in an industry. So I had an industry supervisor and an academic supervisor. That was very good. I was very fortunate in getting that because it really set me up for the career that I wanted, because I wanted something in research. I knew I did not want to do academia because the whole thing really stresses me out. And I think you need a different level of taking care of your mental health for academia. And I wanted to stay in industry. And I've always been really interested in what they call the translational space of science, where you have a discovery or a technology that's ready to go out on the cusp of getting out into the real world and, actually people seeing it and using it. But that in between of making it happen is what I was really interested in. And I was researching and developing a biofertilizer. So it uses soil bacteria that can convert nitrogen that's in the air into fertilizer. So when I did that, I think from there was no turning back. And, I think also the going and doing patisserie was a really good circuit breaker for me because it got everyone off my back. I mean, everyone gave up on me. Everyone gave up on me at that point. They decided I'm a lost cause. She's doing something weird. She's doing something crazy. Where we are going to stop watching this train wreck.
Oh, no.
I mean, it's just like, I'm joking, but it's a bit like, and culturally there's a lot of expectations of doing science and, there's quite a hierarchy in professions. And I felt like I really did break away from the mold in choosing to do culinary, which is not what people were expecting. And I think once everyone kind of took a step back, it was definitely my own decision, and I knew no one was actually telling me, go do this now, or we want to see you do this.
That's such an amazing experience, because it gives you a chance to view your own perspective on your choices. And that's really helpful sometimes. You just need that break. It's so interesting that you did that range of things, because I was going to ask you, like, where did you see a future in microbiology? But at the time, you didn't have that perspective at all until you got additional experience and got to be able to see what kind of other options there are out there. So, what drew you back into science after going to culinary school?
It was two main reasons. One was I was finding, as much as I love being a chef, it was not satisfying my desire to create, because once you start out as a chef, you only get to the point where you're creating new dishes and things in the really like advanced part of your career. When you start out as just a commie chef, you're following directions. And every day to me looked very much like the last. So I was getting quite mentally restless, that I want more, like give me something else to do. So I wanted to satisfy that, more of that problem solving, creating something. And I think more than anything, just where your job involves learning new things, I really was craving that. And so that was one thing that drew me back to science. And the second thing was, it's quite, like I said, quite a hectic job. And there's a lot of urgency to it. And I would sometimes reflect and say, there's a lot of urgency, but at the end of the day, what am I doing? Like, we are preparing food, it's making people happy. But I think I want a bit more. Like, I would love to keep doing this, but I would also like something else. I want to feel like I'm putting something out into the world. And yeah, that's the main reason.
It's nice to be able to see that balance of being able to do more, I guess, short-term immediate gratification creation, as well as long-term curiosity-driven creation. And
yes,
that's a really good balance. So we'll kind of come back to that part later.
yeah.
But in terms of your science, because right now your work involves bacterial and fungal cultures, but how did you get from the biotechnology part of that and veer straight into all these nice tiny little things that make a bigger impact?
Yeah. So, like I said, biotechnology is so broad. You could apply yourself to many different fields. And the field that I found myself in during my master's is what is called as industrial biotechnology. Industrial biotechnology is exactly what it sounds like. You have something like a therapeutic or some product that is useful to the world. And how do you produce it? Hence the industrial part of it. There are many different ways to produce a compound or a product that's of interest. And one of the most efficient ways to produce is through genetic modification of well understood microorganisms. They essentially become like little cell factories. So say you have a product that's produced by some other creature, like it could be a horse, a cow, a bee, plants. Plants are a big one, of course. There are many compounds produced by plants that have potential medical uses. I'm going to simplify it and say you can cut out the gene from the other organism and then stick it into a microbe like fungi like E. coli or Pichia. Those are our favorite well understood ones. And they will essentially produce it for you. And part of our job is to do that and to give those microbes the perfect conditions to produce, heaps of that protein as much as possible. And that involves keeping them nice and happy, understanding what the product is, and creating the perfect conditions for it to want to do that, to actually want to make that product for us. So when I entered into this space, what I was making was a biofertilizer, it's a soil microbe. We don't want it to make anything else. We just want it to do what it does best naturally. So my work was, how do I make as much of this as possible? Again, keeping it as happy as possible. It turned out that microbe was actually quite complex and liked to go into sort of dormant states when it was unhappy, much like a lot of us did during the lockdowns in COVID, I think.
So many parallels.
Yes. So it was working out how to stay active, stay happy, continue to reproduce so that we have lots of these cells that we can use. So I guess the short answer is that biotechnology is quite vast, and one of the fields is microbial biotechnology, industrial microbiology, where you're using microorganisms to produce useful products. And that's what I found myself quite interested in, because of all the things you can do, I feel somehow connected when there's a whole creature that you're working with and you need to understand its quirks, how it grows, what it likes, what it doesn't like. I like that, I can look at it under the microscope and see the whole organism moving around, living its life, as compared to, if you were working on small molecules or proteins. This is just what really speaks to me.
Yeah, that's cool. It's pretty much like literally cultural anthropology, but well, microbial cultural anthropology, which is very, very neat. So, what sort of things have you found the most interesting about figuring out how to create these happy cultures?
I think the best part of my job is that we get such a diversity in projects, because mainly what we do is support upcoming businesses like small biotechs, and they may not necessarily have the facilities to do all the R&D that they need, so they'll approach us and make use of our expertise and all of our technology that we have. In a job like mine, each day looks very different to the last. I've been exposed to so many different types of organisms and products. And I think for me, the most interesting thing is just how each one is so different to the other. You think you've got it figured out, and then the next one comes along and the product is entirely different. It's just produced in such a different way. So you really need to go and read up, look at the literature, see what other people know about this product and how we can apply our knowledge with what's already out there to create this process.
That's very cool. So, what sort of industries have been utilizing this sort of research and development?
There are a lot of industries in the agriculture and food space who make use of this technology. Our team works within the biomedical field. So the kind of products we work on are usually something with medical use. They could be something that is an antimicrobial. It can kill pathogens, especially, we're really focusing on the escape pathogens and the antibiotic resistant strains. That's a really big problem in our field now. There's a lot of work going into that. We are approached by a range of different industries that could be producing vaccines, they could be producing a medicine, they could be producing a compound that can be added to wound dressing. They're trying to develop a new spray to use in hospitals or cleaning solutions. It's so vast. Like, we've seen so many different things.
That's so interesting because it's stuff that can be applied at all stages of so many different supply chains, from the agricultural end to the health end and everything in between, from the sounds of
Yes.
it. Like, it's very, very
Yes.
cool. So what does because I know you said every day for you looks different, but what does a typical day for you look like in terms of the work you do in cultures?
On a typical day, if we are running what we call like our process development experiments, we use equipment called bioreactors, which I like to describe as mega mansions for bacteria, because they're little vessels that we will grow up our cultures in, and the conditions in the vessel are very strictly controlled. So it's controlled at a specific temperature, pH, mixing rate. We're constantly adding in yummy food for the bacteria exactly as it needs at the specific speed that works for it. So a mega mansion, they're in there, we're trying to give them the perfect conditions. My day will be very driven by the protocol. It's very important that we do everything exactly as we've planned, especially when you're trying to, you have a range of different conditions you're testing and you're changing only one condition. You want to make sure that you're doing everything in the same way. And of course, it's not just me. We are a very team-oriented field, so I work with really wonderful people. So my day would involve setting up these instruments, and then that would sort of determine how the week's going to go. We'll be setting up an experiment, and then day to day, we're constantly sampling and monitoring how it's growing. And when I say we're monitoring how it's growing, it's one of those things that you can't actually see it, but you can detect the effects of it. So we can't actually count how many cells are in there, but we can measure the turbidity of the liquid. If it's very turbid, we can then do a calculation to tell us how many cells might be in there. And we'll be testing how much sugar is in there or what sort of residue is in the liquid that will give us an indication of what's going on. At the end of the process, we'll be harvesting all the culture that we've prepared over the week and then processing it and sending it to other teams for more testing, because there's so much expertise in the area, and even the microbial team will work with other departments and use expertise from a range of different professionals to complete a task.
That's very cool. So because you have to do all that setup over whatever period that's designated for the protocol, I guess because it's cultures, you're not starting from scratch. So are you just kind of taking and building each time that you run each of the protocols?
Oh, yeah, this is a really good question. Intuitively, that's what it feels like you would do. Like if you're someone who makes yogurt at home, that's what you're doing. You're basically using some of the last bit for the next bit. But in our work, we can't do that, because every time you have a generation of an organism, you are introducing a potential for natural genetic variation. And because we have so carefully, manipulated the genes of this organism and introduced a foreign gene, we don't want to do that, because you risk either losing that gene of interest or it just developing some other different trait that we don't want it to. So we have what we call as cell banks, and we will store our main stock of cells frozen at minus 80 degrees. And every time we need to use some of it for the next experiment, we will take some out from there. So every run you have, it's always coming from the same source. And that's actually a really important part of the work, to make sure that it always stays the same.
But if you're taking it from the bank, doesn't that mean you'll run out?
The key is to make plenty.
Okay, so you can always still make it from scratch each time to add to the bank, to set the baseline. Oh, that's cool. Didn't know that. That's interesting.
We could make up to 100 vials at once, and that will give us plenty to go for a while. Yeah.
So that's how, because I read one of the other things that some of these cultures are about 100 years old as well.
Yes. The ones that are very old are referring to when we use cultures from collections, so we can gain access to old collections as well.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So interesting, and so much scope, because you're adding so many additional interesting factors over time and in different contexts. No, that's very, very neat.
One thing I could add that I haven't talked about yet is, yes, I did talk a lot about process optimization and this protein production space. But again, like I said, diversity of work. Because we are a team of people who are experts in microbes, we also do get sometimes asked to work on other activities that involve microbiology knowledge. Like one that's been really interesting is testing new antimicrobials. That is, if other parts of the organization have a library of new compounds that they think could be new antibiotics, part of my job is to test these compounds against the known pathogens. So I will grow up what's called the escape pathogens, which are the multi-antibiotic resistant infections in hospitals, which is really our target infections. So I'll grow the pathogens and test the compounds against them and see if they're actually able to successfully kill these antibiotic-resistant bacteria as well.
That's cool. So you're running battery tests against what they've developed to see whether you can break it.
Yes, basically. It's normally high throughput testing, but I call it higher throughput because it's not entirely done by machines. It's still very much done by us. But we use robots to make it just so that we can test up to I think I've tested 2,000 compounds at a time.
Oh my goodness. So over what period would you do that many?
A week.
A
or less,
week.
3 days, yeah.
Wow, that's a lot.
Robots are cool.
Yeah, robots are cool. Nice. So, yeah, that's very, very cool. There's so much that I could ask you about antimicrobial resistant pathogens that I think would take much longer than we have time for. So I might have to let that one go. Yeah, I have lots of questions about this.
We can go a little bit more into it.
Do I want to talk about the protocols for handling pathogens? Yeah, I'm going to ask that one and then we'll move on.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
The fact that you are culturing these pathogens to test against potential new antibiotics and medicines. What's the protocol handling them? Because there's so many different types, and then there's the interactions in between them and having to isolate all of this kind of stuff. So
That's right.
is there anything particularly interesting a complete layperson would want to know about how you handle culturing pathogens?
Well, there's different classes of pathogens, what we call the risk group. And that is a standard classification in Australia. So very harmful pathogens, what you call risk group 3, risk group 4, are not something that most labs are equipped to handle. We would not even be able to get those strains in. That is handled more like there are specific laboratories to do that. And it's exactly what you're picturing that you see on TV of people in astronaut-looking suits. You know, it's done with a huge level of safety and seriousness as it should be. The kind of pathogens I'm talking about are much less risk level that we are definitely equipped to handle. We still need approvals and certifications to do so. And it's just all about training, good practice. We have dedicated spaces for that work, dedicated people for that work. And we take all the precautions to make sure that everybody's always safe. But fundamentally, like, we are allowed to work with pathogens that cannot just escape into the world. So even like a mistake cannot happen because we have very strict rules. But even if something did happen, it's not a pathogen that could go off into the world and start infecting people.
It's not going to become a medical drama trope.
No. That's where the movie analogy stops.
Awesome. That's very cool because, yeah, I think people forget that in order to be able to treat these sorts of conditions, you have to be able to have access to them. Cool. So from cultivating happy microbial cultures and their identities to something a little bit closer to home. Another thing that you're really passionate about is cultivating a culture of acceptance and community for queer people of colour, and so that they can feel safe being who they are. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your part of that journey.
Yes, I would love to. I really like talking about this. And the reason I say I really like talking about this is because being able to talk about it is a privilege. Many people can't. You know, they'll go their whole lives never talking to anyone about it. So yes, I will take every opportunity to use the privilege that I do have to share my journey and talk about the importance of talking about it in the world and hearing all these stories out there. When I lived in India, so I was raised in India, it was against the law to be queer. The good thing is it no longer is against the law. It is decriminalized, but that is just one step in a long journey because there's lots of things, lots of policies that need to be in place for queer people to truly be equal, like anti-discrimination laws, legalizing marriage. And so we have a long way to go. And I came out, I realized I was queer and came out to friends and family when I was in India. I realized when I was 17, came out in my 20s. And then when I moved to Australia, it was, I was sort of like experimenting with being out to everyone, not making this something to hide. But there's a lot of internalized homophobia you pick up when you're in a different culture that isn't very accepting of these things. So coming to Australia has been quite interesting. It was not exactly what I expected because I had this very like Hollywood version of how life was going to be once I got here. There's going to be rainbows everywhere and there's going to be pride every day. But it's obviously not the case, right? There's a lot of bias still around and there are lots of allies and equally a lot of people who don't understand or are not necessarily very accepting or just ignorant of the facts. So when I started doing my master's, I was not out at all. And actually, in fact, where I did my master's is also where I was employed soon after. So it was within the same team. So they'd known me quite a while. And once I came out at work, I mean, the positive part is just the load that was off my shoulders, right? Like, I can't put in words the difference it makes to not have to hide something. Or like, you have these sort of lunch table conversations where someone says, oh, like something boyfriend. And then it's so awkward to choose, do I correct them? Should I not correct them? Is this going to be unnecessary drama or oversharing? All of these sort of like overthinking and questions would come in. And eventually I joined like the Pride group at work, met really, really wonderful people. So that's the positive part. But the parts that I'm still like finding to be a bit of a challenge is finding identity. Here, I think being an immigrant can be very confusing because you're sort of stuck in between, you don't quite fit in at home, don't quite fit in where you've moved to. So you're like, oh, where am I? Who are my people? And I found that to become quite like it's almost like not a barrier, but just like something I was working through, because I found that a lot of queer spaces that I entered here were very Western and just not aligning with my values. Or it was that I just didn't necessarily feel welcome all the time. So there's the intersectionality of it is something that's
Very complicated.
very complicated. And I think I was struggling with like a lot of people not understanding how difficult it was for me to be out, because there was still very much a part of my brain that was saying this is wrong and I shouldn't, because when I was in India, I was convinced that I'm never going to be out. Like, it's not safe.
Just for a bit of context, so for the listeners, homosexuality only became decriminalized, I think, in 2018, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a relatively recent thing. And here in Australia, a lot of the conversations we tend to have are about things like medical and legal rights for partners, as well as recognition of gay marriage. But that is quite a long way into that journey of acceptance here. Whereas in India, it's only just beginning that part of that journey.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, so having to create that bridge as an immigrant here as well, and having to straddle both sides of that particular journey has to be very taxing.
Yes, it is. It's confusing because I feel like when I go out to queer spaces, the queer part of me does feel included, but then also this is culturally like not a comfortable place for me because, I don't know, sometimes my friend, we use the term like the glittery, sparkly party sort of energy, which isn't quite what was sitting well for me either, because those are the kind of events that get put out there. And I mean, it's just like a struggle for introverts in general as well, isn't it? But it gets a lot more complex, and there's the queer aspect and the immigrant aspect to it as well. And there's also a really strange dynamic that comes in where once I came out in life in Australia in general, there might have been people who, before I was out, viewed me in a certain way, that they had some sort of bias of like, oh, she's Indian and this is what I think that means and this is what I'm expecting from her. And then when I came out, it threw them a little bit because the idea of an Indian woman who's also queer was novel to them. They'd never heard of it.
There's no nice little box that you can kind of put someone in because of all those intersectionalities.
Yes, because there's just not as much visibility of people of color who are queer, right? And that's just, again, coming from that cultural context. It's not safe most of the time for a lot of people of color to be out. So you don't have as many role models. You don't have as many celebrities. So they would be a bit thrown by it. And then they would start to like me a little bit more. Like, oh, this is cool. This is a unique feature of this person. Like, oh, how interesting. She's brown and she's queer. Wow. And then like suddenly would accept me now as a queer person more than they would have accepted me as a person of color who was straight. Which I didn't like. I'm like, this is not okay either.
It's so many layers of the acceptance thing because it's what people what their experience has exposed them to. So have they been exposed to more migrants? Have been exposed to more queer people? Which is the thing that, like, where have they put that in their tier of acceptance and normalness in?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
in their tier of values. It's very nuanced and complicated.
Yeah, it is. And I'm only like, I feel like I'm only just starting to unpick it a little bit. And I think it's, again, in my mind, the way I make sense of it is that often queerness is viewed as a Western thing. So when someone might have an unconscious bias towards people of color and then they hear that they're queer, it westernizes that person in a little way. It's something that it's hard to fight for people you come out to, but also it's hard to fight within yourself as well, to find your identity as a queer person of color while also preserving everything about your cultural background that you do value, and not like using the queerness as a way to westernize yourself, because then, your exposure to queerness is influenced by what you're seeing. Identity does become complicated, but, it forces you to introspect and be aware of your perspective, what you're doing. And I've caught myself doing that a few times where I feel like to fit in with queer groups, I've changed certain things about myself and then say, wait a second, I think this is where it was coming from and I'd rather not change this about myself. And at the same time, you will find things that you don't want to change about yourself as well.
There's a lot of code switching you're having to do now because of all the different environments and contexts that you have to exist in. And the whole idea about queerness being a Western concept is fascinating, but I understand exactly what you mean by that. And, when you come from Asian or migrant cultures, no doubt most of us will have had the parents go, oh, you're getting so westernized now. You're getting so Aussie. And it's like, but what does that mean? What aspects of personality and identity relate to westernization? It's such a peculiar idea that this aspect of identity is culturally influenced. I'm sure there are papers and papers written about this.
I'm sure. And that also then plays into like, once you are this beautiful human being who's been through all of the things and you've taken a little bit from your culture and a little bit from the Australian culture and you created this person that you are. And then you go and then you try and find community in like queer settings, then the Indian part is confusing. And then if I go and try and find community in Indian settings, and then you get asked like, so when are you getting married? And you're just like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to answer this.
It's like, well, where shall we begin?
So, and then you again go back to, is it safe to, come out here? Is it not? Are you going to accept it? Are you not? Because there's a weight of thousands of years of culture.
I do not envy the minefield of cultural expectation that you have to navigate just to get through life. Oh my goodness. So, have you found being in Australia easier for you to create or cultivate your new identity, or not really a new identity, but I guess embed that identity?
Yes, most definitely. This has been the best thing, I think. Being in Australia has been very freeing because it is most of the time, more or less, safe to be out. And I think if I was in a situation where it was not safe to be out, I know what to do. There are systems in place that can help, that have things to fall back on. And that has been a really good move for me because, okay, I'll give you a little bit of a story. When I was in the early stages of figuring out, my sexual orientation, how do I come out? How do I navigate the world now that I know this about myself? For one thing, it answered a lot of questions, right? Because you always, like every young queer person will relate, most likely relate to feeling all their lives that there's just something that isn't clicking. Like, why am I just not feeling the same way all my peers are feeling? So there was that really good revelation, but then also the challenge of how on earth am I going to tell my very traditional Indian parents about this? How am I going to tell family? How am I going to tell friends? Is society ever going to accept me? And I once talked to a doctor about it, and fully, this no joke, was told, oh, why don't you attend this psychiatrist clinic where they will give you help to become bisexual? I'm a lesbian, I'm not bisexual. And then I said, but why? He said, oh, because that's just going to make your life so much easier, and we can do that for you. So I think,
so
I wonder,
interesting as an approach.
It's bizarre. It's bizarre. Look, I have also, to be clear, I've had a wonderful psychologist in India who was so accepting and changed my life and was pivotal in me coming out. I actually came out to my parents in a group family session with a psychologist in the room, which honestly, life hack for young queer people. Do it. Because like if your parents ask you like questions that you may not know how to answer, there's a professional in the room that they cannot yell at. They cannot scold them. So do it that way if you can.
It's an expert in the room. It's fine.
Yes. Like it was almost like my coming out was peer reviewed, which really worked for my sciencey parents because they like looked at the psychologist and were like, "You agree with what she's saying?" Okay.
You've got a thesis defense going.
Yes. So, but the reason I gave all of that background is because I think, given all of that, if I had stayed in India, I don't think I would be who I was today because I was very much mentally restricting myself. I was very bogged down by the anxiety of the future. And having that much anxiety on a day-to-day basis will really reduce your capacity to do other things and won't let you grow into the full version of yourself. Moving here has really given me the freedom to discover who I am. A lot of queer people, I think, will also relate to sort of like the later in life coming of age and realizing who you are, which I think a lot of people will experience in their teens. I've had those sort of realizations in my 20s because, this is where I'm starting to really feel like I'm living my full life. And of course, like here, I've had the good fortune of living with friends who are so accepting. I call them friends, but they're family because we've known each other all our lives. And it's very different to be taken out of that setting of like community that you want to be accepted, but you can't, than to suddenly be in a place where everybody knows and everyone's okay with it. It's quite life-changing.
Absolutely. And yeah, it allows you to thrive because you don't have that concern bogging you down anymore. Thank you so much for sharing that because it's such an important aspect of not just being a migrant, but being queer and being different or feeling different in your home and your chosen environment. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you. I'll just add quickly that I went to Mardi Gras in Sydney last year and it was amazing because I had been to New York Pride by myself when I was 20. Nobody in my family knew I was going and I went there on my own. This was the first queer setting I'd been in and it was a lot. It was really full on. I sort of made friends with strangers. And then to go to Mardi Gras with work, with a community of wonderful people, it was incredible. It was just, I don't know. It's crazy to just be so immersed in an environment that's just everyone's like you, everyone's accepting. It's just like I think healed a lot from the past. And it was around that time that I sort of realized that I think what I want to see in the world is more role models of diverse backgrounds. Because I think as a young person, if I'd seen someone out there that I admired who looked a little bit like me and was queer, it would have made a world of difference just to know that this is okay and making a positive association that a queer person can be happy, a queer person can be successful, a queer person can thrive and not just keep it a secret and not seeing another option. Why I choose to put myself out there is because I'm like, if on the off chance that some young person who looks a little bit like me can see me and identify with me, and that can give them some assurance about their future, that would, that's like life goals accomplished. Nothing would make me happier.
Absolutely. And having that representation isn't just good for the person who's experiencing that, but it normalizes it for the members of their family and community who need to see that representation as well and who need to see the examples because, we know our Asian families love being put against other people as an example.
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah, being able to have the opportunity, well, they're okay. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think also there's a lot of benefit in like a diversity of professions being seen out there as well, because if all like the elder ethnic family people, like all the aunties and uncles, if all they ever see are actors and actresses or singers who are queer, they're going to associate queerness with that profession. But then if you see like architects, bankers, chefs, scientists, everyone, like
Regular jobs.
yeah, it could be anyone. Like I think that would be really nice to see.
And maybe the next Indian culinary chef isn't going to get shunned by their family.
Right? I have to say that I'm blessed because I have a very accepting family now. It was a journey, but we've got there.
Amazing. Well, I'm glad that you got there. That's the important part. So, speaking about your culinary journey and how that contributed to, finding your identity as well. You'd always wanted or been interested in the culinary aspect, but what made you start your venture up for As You Whisk as a cake business alongside your career as a microbiologist?
Like I said, I've always loved baking. And every time I baked, I had a designated taste tester, a designated decorator, and that was my best friend. We've known each other since we were 3. And every time I baked, she would receive all the results of the experiments, both the successful and the failed ones. And she's an artist. So at some point, she got really curious about decorating and using like buttercream as a way of making art. And she started picking up on that. Somewhere along the way, we just casually said to each other, oh, wouldn't it be fun, like, if we can make it a real thing, have a little business, like, how fun would it be? And then we'd be like, yeah, that'd be pretty fun. And then move on, as you do when, you think that things can never really happen. And we got to a point when we realized that there was actually nothing that's stopping us from doing it. And it was not like a primary source of income. It was just, we really wanted to do it. And she discovered that she can actually paint like landscapes and things on cake. And that was really exciting. She could paint on macarons, and that was really cool. So we wanted to start doing that. And around the same time, I had quit my kitchen jobs. And like I said earlier, I told you that one of the big things that was missing with my jobs in kitchen was that I couldn't create things. But the good thing about being the boss of yourself is that you can do what you want to do. So we kind of set to work. We wanted to make desserts the way we like them. Like I don't know if you like fondant on cakes, like the rolled out sugar sweet stuff. We didn't want to use any of that. So we only wanted to use buttercream. We wanted to keep everything low sweet and mild. And I think it was the best of both worlds for me. I got to do science, and then I also get everything that I love about being a pastry chef. I still get to do that in my life in like a serious way. It's more than a hobby. We're both extremely driven and passionate about it. And it's been great. We do like market stalls and get to meet members of the community. We take orders from people, and it's just like good for the soul, because it's one of those jobs where you end up in like the celebratory moments of people's lives. You get to see kids turning 1, you get to see anniversaries, and you see people in like the happiest parts of their life, and like then to hear the feedback you get. And it's great. Like it's a heartwarming job.
Literal slice of life, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very, very heartwarming job. And I think it's good for people to have a side hustle. It's easy to let work become your whole identity because you do spend most of your time at work. But I think it's also important to remember that you love what you do, but also the work you're doing needs to facilitate life outside of it. And yeah, I like the balance it brings.
And it's incredible because all of the skills that you've just developed working in kitchens, going to culinary schools, working in labs, and doing all that industry research stuff, it's all very complementary to the kind of
Yes.
work and running your own business and connecting with people in so many different ways. It really, it gives you this whole view of more completeness in different aspects of your life.
Yes, definitely. And it's nice to own a small business because that's like a piece of your heart. You put everything you have into it.
Yeah, it's really quite rewarding. So I've touched on like the fact that all of your evolved skill sets are complementary, but what have you found yourself taking from your different spaces into those other spaces as transferable skills?
Preciseness in measuring things out.
The precision of the pastry chef.
Yes, I mean it's in both, right? You need to precisely weigh out something, whether that's chemicals or flour, you know. But I guess jokes aside, what I find in common between like both fields is that there is like an idea of something novel that's driving you, and in both fields you are working towards optimizing something to create the best possible outcome. And the approach is quite similar, whether that's in science or in cooking. And I think both baking and science bring that sweet spot of calculative preciseness blended with a creative approach. I think that's where my skills and my happiness lies. And I think anything I do in life, that's what I'm seeking.
Yeah, absolutely. Just wanting to be able to create that blend of both aspects to be able to create something new. Love it.
Yeah.
And one last question before I let you go. What advice would you give someone who'd like to do what you do, and what advice should they ignore?
What advice you should ignore, in my opinion, is I think having a long-term plan might be a bit overrated. Like, if you have one, amazing, excellent, follow your dream. But if you don't have that vision of this is who I want to be when I grow up, which I still ask myself, who do I want to be when I grow up at the age of 27? It's okay if you don't have a fixed idea. I think in my life, I don't know if I have authority to give people advice, but for me, this has worked. Just doing the next best thing, the next thing that I know I will enjoy. Often taking those kind of steps of short-term joy will lead you to finding exactly where you want to be, where you're creating the impact that you wanted to, and you're enjoying your work while doing that. Often for me, like very big long-term goals have either not end up being where I went and I'm better off for it, or it just kind of, you get a bit stressed because life is not going that way. So if you feel a pressure to have a fixed goal for the future, just let it go. It's okay. It's overrated. And the piece of advice I might give people is that I think when you see professionals, you enter a professional space, often you tend to notice like the best of people. You see people doing really well, people showing forward the best versions of themselves. And as a young person, it's really easy to feel intimidated and to feel like you need to be a certain way or you need to be like them in order to fit in or to be as successful as them. But I think it took a while to truly get to a place where I'm like, no, I'm going to be myself, right? I don't want to lose who I am in the process of trying to look like what a confident and successful person should look like. And once you get there, like the confidence will show, like you'll truly feel it. It does not have to look for you how it looks for other people. So when you get into a workspace, especially like in a place like science where you might make mistakes, you may not always make the best decisions, it's very empowering to own up to them. Just say, this is what I thought. This was my thought process. This is what I did. Or I was clumsy. I dropped it. I'm so sorry. That's okay. Just be honest. Don't hide mistakes. Accept it. Part of life. We're all human. And I think that embracing those flaws will lead you to eventually like that spot where you're quite happy with who you are and happy for everyone else to see it and not feel the need to hide it behind like a more confident than you are lens or a more Western than you are sort of mask.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't have to be perfect because it's all a process anyway, and you'll figure it out. And as long as you're aspiring, or as long as you're learning who you are as you go, that's the important part.
Exactly.
Amazing. That's incredible advice. And yeah, so thank you so much, Jaya, for sharing with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time in having this conversation about your journey, about your very, very cool work, and your own path to identity and all the different cultures that you work with on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. This has been really fun.
Yes, thank you so much. So if people would like to find out more about the kind of work that you do, where can they go?
You can put my LinkedIn. I'm pointing like the
Yes.
YouTubers in the bio.
Link and subscribe.
Yeah, just find me on LinkedIn. I'll be there.
Amazing. And I'll also add a link to As You Whisk.
Yes, please do. Have a look. We have some cute pictures up there if you ever want to scroll through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw that you do a gulab jamun cheesecake, which sounds delicious.
Oh, yes. Oh, I'm so proud of that. Like going back to culture and fusions, what better way to show that than through food? Because that's Indian and not quite at the same time.
It's an incredible blend of flavors and cultures. It's delicious. Cool. All right. So again, thank you so much, Jaya, for speaking with me. And I hope you have an incredible rest of your day.
Thank you. You too, Michele. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please let me know. Subscribe to this show, leave us a rating, and share this with your geeky or geek curious friends. You can also support Steam Powered on Patreon under Steam Powered Show, the link for which will also be in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.